The explosion of water hit so hard it shook my windows. I ran outside just in time to see the storm unleashing everything Sylvia Crane had caused, an entire river charging downhill, searching for the drainage path she'd buried under her project. The flood slammed into my new concrete barrier with a boom, and the wall didn't move an inch. Instead, the water twisted, recoiled, and surged backward toward her mansion, swallowing her rose garden in seconds. Lightning flashed, her sliding door bowed under the pressure, and just as the glass began to crack, a shadow moved inside her living room. I first knew Sylvia Crane was trouble the morning she marched into the drainage corridor with a convoy of machinery behind her. No announcement, no permission, just her pointing at the natural runoff channel like it was a weed she planned to yank out of her yard. "Dump it here," she barked, waving a glossy blueprint labeled Crystal Garden Expansion. Within seconds, a loader tilted forward, releasing a full bucket of soil straight into the creek bed. I sprinted over the fence line. "Sylvia, that's a regulated drainage path. You can't bury it." She turned the rainproof hood of her designer jacket, barely staying put. One sentence showed exactly who she was. "I decide what this neighborhood looks like." That was the only personality she ever needed. Entitlement, sharpened into authority. I tried again. "Heavy storms roll straight through this slope. If you block it, the water won't disappear, it'll hit both our homes." Her smirk didn't even flicker. "I elevated my yard last month. Water takes the lower ground, Mason, meaning yours." That one line told me her motive: protect her garden at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing my property. Because of my engineering work, I knew instantly what her soil compaction and angle would do in a downpour. But explaining physics to Sylvia Crane was like lecturing a brick wall. She clapped her hands at the workers. "Keep filling it. I want roses right up to the fence." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just ignoring danger. She was manufacturing it. The first rain didn't even qualify as a storm, barely half an inch. But by late afternoon, I stepped onto my back patio and felt mud sucking at my boots. Water wasn't running through the old drainage path anymore. It was spilling sideways, curling past my garden beds, pooling beneath my deck stairs, like it was choosing a new direction out of spite. Across the property line, Sylvia stood on her elevated terrace, wine glass in hand, calmly watching the flow she'd created. A few stones from her Crystal Garden Expansion had already washed loose, bobbing in the runoff like defeated soldiers. I motioned toward the flooding. "This is from your fill. It's already redirecting." She leaned on her railing, unimpressed. "You're overreacting, Mason. It's a drizzle." That was all she offered, one dismissive note, one smug look. Then she went inside, sliding her glass door shut, as if closing the conversation forever. By evening, the water receded. But the message was clear. If this was what half an inch of rain could do, the approaching storm system was going to tear the neighborhood apart, starting with my property. And Sylvia, she didn't just ignore the warning signs, she admired them. 2 days later, another rain band swept through, still minor, but stronger. I was home when it hit, working on a set of foundation schematics at my kitchen table. The moment I heard the first splatter of runoff hitting my lower porch, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. My yard was worse this time. Water wasn't just creeping in. It was carving channels, dragging mulch, peeling sod from the slope. It looked like someone had taken a knife to the earth. Sylvia appeared right on cue, strolling along her back walkway like she was inspecting her masterpiece. She lifted her phone, snapped a picture of my muddy lawn, and called out, "Maybe buy some decent boots. This is normal runoff. Nature happens." Normal. I'd spent years on construction sites diagnosing failed grading systems. What she'd built wasn't runoff. It was a funnel aimed squarely at my home. I crouched near the old creek bed, now buried beneath her imported fill. One press of my palm told me everything. The soil was packed too tight, forming a solid barrier. Stormwater couldn't penetrate. It had no choice but to slide sideways into me. "Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice steady, "this slope is engineered to channel water safely. You just turned it into a wall." She waved a hand without facing me. "Relax. I leveled my yard last week. My contractor said it would handle anything." "Anything except nature," I muttered. But she didn't hear me. Or she didn't care. The next rainfall wasn't small. Not catastrophic, but enough to show me the future, and it didn't look good. Water breached the edge of my storage shed, seeping beneath the metal frame. I lunged forward, throwing 2 toolboxes up onto a shelf, just as a sheet of muddy runoff swept across the floor. The sight hit me like a punch. If water was reaching this far in a moderate storm, the incoming one, forecasted at 8 inches in 24 hours, would swallow my entire backyard. I didn't have time to panic. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the radar models, and marched straight to Sylvia's property line. "Sylvia, listen carefully. This weekend storm is massive. 8 inches of rainfall, high winds, saturated ground, you've built a perfect dam. If you don't clear this, it will be catastrophic. She didn't even look at the radar. She just folded her arms. I've raised my soil. My property is secure. Yours is lower. That's hardly my fault. So your solution is to sacrifice my home, I snapped. She smiled just one small, triumphant curve of her lips. I'll handle my land, you handle yours. Fine. She wanted me to handle mine, then I would. That evening, I ordered 72 concrete blocks, marine-grade cement, and enough rebar to tie the entire structure together. My crew, Darius and Colton, arrived before sunrise. We dug fast, setting a trench exactly where the redirected water spilled into my lawn. Every minute felt like a countdown, a race against the storm brewing over the horizon. The wall wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be. It was built to survive what Sylvia Crane had created. We were smoothing the final row of concrete when Sylvia stormed out of her back door, clutching a binder thick with HOA regulations. She marched straight toward my fence line, fury practically vibrating off her. What is that monstrosity? She demanded, pointing at the 4-foot wall. Protection, I replied. It's an eyesore. It violates community aesthetics. As HOA president, I'm issuing a notice $600 per day until you remove it, Darius muttered. Lady, this thing might save the whole neighborhood. Sylvia spun on him like a hawk. This is a private dispute. Stay out of it. I stepped forward. Sylvia, you caused the risk. I'm mitigating it. You are ruining property values, she snapped. Property values. Not safety, not flood prevention, not the structural integrity of our homes. Just the appearance of a wall she didn't like. But I didn't argue back. All I said was, you'll thank me later. Her glare sharpened. Don't count on it. She turned and strode away, heels, stabbing the walkway. The storm clouds above us swirled darker, thick, heavy, impatient. I checked the forecast again. We were out of time. Cinderstorm arrived like the sky had finally decided to snap. By midnight, winds screamed against the siding. Rain came down in sheets so dense, the backyard vanished behind a gray curtain. The hill above us funneled water faster than I'd ever seen an entire system overwhelmed at once. At 1, 2, 4, 3 a.m., I stepped outside and felt the ground trembling. A river, an actual roaring river, was charging straight toward my new wall. It hit with a thunderous boom. Concrete shuddered. Rebar hummed. The impact vibrated through my bones. But the wall didn't crack, didn't lean, didn't surrender an inch. Instead, the flood recoiled, swirling violently, forced to find the only other path available, the one Sylvia had created by burying the original drainage. The surge slammed back toward her mansion. Her elegant stone borders tore loose instantly, snapping apart and whirling around like debris caught in a whirlpool. The rose beds she'd spent thousands on disappeared beneath churning black water. Lightning split the sky, white, jagged, merciless, illuminating the moment the flood reached her rear patio. The sliding glass door bowed inward, pulsing under the pressure like a lung struggling to breathe. I felt the air shift. Hydraulic pressure had reached critical levels. Then, a sharp crack knifed through the storm. The glass buckled. The frame twisted. One more surge, just one, and a silhouette stumbled into view inside her living room. And that's when I realized Sylvia wasn't just losing her garden. She was seconds away from losing her entire house. The glass finally surrendered with a sound I'll never forget. Half explosion, half scream. A torrent of black water punched through Sylvia's sliding door and swallowed her living room in seconds. Lamps toppled, cushions spun. A white armchair floated upward like a lost ship. Her silhouette staggered backward, arms flailing, as the surge lifted her off her feet. I shouted, but the storm devoured my voice. Within minutes, neighbors' porch lights flicked on, one after another, splashing pale yellow across the chaotic scene. People stepped out in robes, sweaters, umbrellas, trembling in their hands as they stared at the mansion unraveling before them. Every face carried the same stunned expression, disbelief. "Is she inside?" someone yelled. She was by the door, another called back. Then the sirens wailed deep, rising, cutting through rain like a blade. Fire trucks skidded to a stop at the intersection, lights spinning red across the waterlogged street. Firefighters rushed toward her property with hoses, pumps, and emergency cutters, but the current fought them like a living creature. The flood wasn't entering gently, it was roaring through every doorway, dragging furniture across the tile in violent sweeps. One firefighter braced himself against the current and shouted toward me, "Did you see what caused this overflow?" I pointed at the buried drainage path. She blocked the creek. The storm just did the rest. He looked at the rising water, jaw tightening. "All right, we'll need evidence fast." I had it. and the storm had just supplied the rest. By dawn, pump engines were roaring across Sylvia's property. Mud coated her patio like dried asphalt. Her once pristine garden was now an uprooted battlefield of torn soil and shattered stone. The insurance adjuster arrived around 7 a.m. Grant Hollis, a tall, quiet man in a dark rain jacket. He didn't smile, didn't shake hands, just surveyed the wreckage with a measured calm that suggested he'd seen disasters, but rarely self-inflicted ones of this scale. Sylvia approached him with shaking hands. I pay for full coverage. This is an act of God. You need to start processing my loss. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to me. You're Mason Caldwell, right? I was told you reported structural interference before the storm. I nodded and slipped a folder from my waterproof bag. Inside were photos time-stamped showing Sylvia directing the machinery, standing proudly over the filled drainage channel, waving her blueprint like a victory flag. This is the blocked natural runoff, I said. This channel has handled storms for decades. She sealed it. Grant inspected the photos carefully, then knelt to examine the slope. He pressed a glove into the ground, lifted a clump of dense, compacted soil, and let it crumble between his fingers. This is a hard obstruction, he concluded. The water had nowhere to go. Sylvia's voice cracked. But I elevated my garden, the contractor said. Ma'am, Grant said, closing the folder, no insurance policy covers damages caused by illegal alteration of a drainage easement. This wasn't an act of God. This was the result of intentional landscape modification. Her face froze mid-breath, color draining as fast as her flooded living room the night before. Your claim is denied, he finished, and the State Water Board will need these photos. The last shred of her control shattered right there on the muddy patio. By late morning, 2 state inspectors and a county hydrology officer were standing in Sylvia's backyard, surveying the devastation. They didn't sugarcoat anything. This is a violation of Section 482.41, Inspector said plainly. Blocking a designated drainage line is a criminal offense. Sylvia's voice broke. I just wanted to improve my yard. I didn't think. That's the problem, the officer replied. You didn't think. And now the runoff has compromised structural integrity in 3 rooms of your home. One inspector handed her a printed notice, mandatory restoration order. Fine, $12,500. Full creek excavation required within 30 days. Her knees buckled. She had to catch herself against a half-broken planter. Neighbors had gathered along the fence line, whispering, watching the woman who'd ruled the HOA for 5 years finally hit a wall she couldn't boss around. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked satisfied. Most simply looked relieved. Then came the final blow. Sylvia's HOA council members, people she'd practically handpicked, arrived in a small cluster. Their faces were tight, uneasy, rehearsed. The vice president stepped forward. Sylvia, in light of the incident, the financial risk, and the violation of municipal law, we're requesting your immediate resignation as HOA president. She stared at them, stunned. You're firing me. Now we're protecting the association, he said quietly. The moment stretched painfully long until she finally lowered her head. I resign. The words dropped like stones into muddy water. Firefighters continued pumping the remains of her living room behind her. The house that once symbolized her control now sagged under the weight of her decisions. Floors, warped walls, swollen furniture, ruined electrical systems drowned. And as she stood among the rubble, rain still dripping from the broken edges of her terrace, she looked up at me across the fence. Her voice was barely audible. You warned me. I didn't answer. The storm had already said everything. By early afternoon, the worst of the storm had passed. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with that sharp metallic scent that always follows a night of destruction. Firefighters were still working in Sylvia Crane's living room, pumping out the last inches of muddy water while carrying soaked furniture out through the broken frame of her sliding door. Every object that passed through the threshold, ruined rugs, warped tables, a collapsed bookshelf, told the same story. The flood hadn't spared a single room. Neighbors gathered along the fence line, their boots sinking into the softened ground. No one spoke loudly. The chaos from last night still clung to the air, making everything feel unreal. Some residents offered quiet condolences to Sylvia. Others just watched with the heavy silence of people who had spent years under her strict HOA leadership. I stood on my side of the fence, hands resting on the top row of my concrete wall. It had dried overnight, solid, unmoving, carrying no scars except a faint pattern where water had slammed against it. For the first time since Sylvia buried the drainage channel, I felt the pressure ease from my shoulders. One clean breath. That was enough. A firefighter walked past us and shook his head. I've seen blockages cause backyard flooding before, he said, surveying the mess, but never something this widespread. This was preventable. The neighbors murmured, a wave of agreement passing through them. Even without looking at Sylvia, I could sense her shrinking under the weight of those words. The state hydrology officer returned within the hour, clipboard in hand, boots splattered with mud. He didn't waste time. "Miss Crane," he said, projecting just loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're required to begin immediate restoration of the original drainage corridor. Full excavation, removal of all imported fill, slope stabilization, and contour correction." He handed her a second document, a formal citation stamped in red. "Total fines come to $12,500. Failure to comply will result in additional penalties." Sylvia's face tightened as she scanned the paperwork. Her garden, her pride, her trophy project, the one she'd expanded at everyone else's expense, was now listed as unauthorized obstruction and scheduled for demolition. The HOA board members, who had remained quiet earlier, stepped forward with a kind of reluctant unity. The vice president cleared his throat. "We'll organize an emergency meeting this evening to assign interim responsibilities. The neighborhood needs stability." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. It was simply the reality that Sylvia's leadership ended the moment she turned a creek into a dam. One board member approached me afterward, voice low. "We didn't know she buried the easement. If we had known sooner, this could have been stopped." I gave a small nod. "Now you do. And now you fix it." He didn't argue. He just pocketed his pen and walked off toward the others. The county truck arrived next, dropping off survey flags and contour markers. Workers moved around Sylvia's yard, placing stakes where new trenches would be cut, restoring the natural waterway exactly where it had existed for decades. Watching it happen felt like watching order return to the land itself. As the crews dispersed and the neighbors drifted back to their homes, the storm's aftermath took on a strange, quiet beauty. My wall, still damp from the night, stood like a dark green spine across the yard. I'd painted it moss green 2 days earlier, hoping it might blend in when this was all over. I stepped closer and touched the surface. It was cold, solid, reliable, everything the buried creek had once been before it was tampered with. On the other side of the fence, Sylvia stood alone amid the remains of her ruined garden. The roses she'd fought so hard to protect were gone. Soil from her expansion plan lay scattered in thick brown clumps across a patio that now sagged at the edges. She stared at the muddy waterline across her siding, her expression hollow, like she was still trying to make sense of the wreckage. Our eyes met for just a moment. No anger, no yelling, just a quiet acknowledgement of what happens when someone tries to bend nature and everyone around them to their will. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. Instead, I walked back to my porch, sat down, and let the damp breeze roll in. The yard smelled like rain, earth, and something else, justice maybe. A natural balance restored. As I glanced once more at the green wall, standing firm across my property line, one truth settled cleanly in my mind. Water always finds a path, and sometimes it finds the perfect one to set things right.